59 years ago tomorrow, in other words, Friday, Ronald Reagan delivered his iconic, quote, unquote, a time for choosing speech. In this speech, the future president laid out in very stark terms the challenges that Americans faced as a nation due to a bloated federal government that threatened Americans' prosperity and individual freedoms. Well, America is once again at a time for choosing, and much like Reagan's time, the issues confronting us cross party lines. This would be a good time for me to say that we have a partial step in this direction because of the Biden-McCarthy agreement in June not to shut down the government, because the government couldn't issue debt. So here we are again. We have even the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and others warning policymakers that absent changes, the retirement of the baby boom generation would result in an explosion of debt and deficit. Yet, we in the Congress have turned a blind eye as the country walked headlong towards a fiscal cliff. For 40 years, our public debt averaged around 35% of our economy. But over the past 15 years, that debt has grown by leaps and bounds. First came the 2008 financial crisis, which led to a $6 trillion leap in public debt in just 4 years after 2008. This amounted to a doubling of the national debt as a share of the economy, rising from 35%, where it was for about 40 years, to over 70% of GDP. Then we all know what the pandemic has done to the public debt. The pandemic hits, and public debt went upwards by $7.5 trillion over 3 years. As a result, public debt soared to roughly equal to our nation's entire annual economic output, or what you would say, have economists tell you, that's about 100% of GDP. Now that brings us to where we are today. And to take Ronald Reagan's advice very seriously, a nation drowning in a sea of red ink with no life preserver or a rescue boat in sight. What's more, debt continues to rain down upon us at a record clip. The fiscal year 2023 deficit checked in at $2 trillion once you adjust for the Supreme Court striking down the Biden student loan bailout. Measured as a share of GDP, that 100% I just talked about, the 2023 deficit was larger than in all but 5 years since 1945. Our historic deficit was fueled in part by rising interest payments on the debt, which alone cost $711 billion. The cost to service our debt is expected to consume an increasing larger share of the federal budget. While we argue about what we should or shouldn't spend taxpayers' money on, interest on the debt, is crowding out our priorities and shrinking our options going forward. And this all automatically happens because you pay the interest on the national debt or you default. And we don't want to do that. And that's what the Biden-McCarthy agreement of June kept us from happening. Going back to June, the CBO projected that servicing our debt over the next 10 years would cost $10.4 trillion. However, that projection was made before rates on Treasury bonds used to finance our debt surged to a 16-year high. The rate on a 10-year Treasury bond is now a full percentage point higher than what CBO assumed this spring, all of that adding to our deficit problems. But these higher than expected borrowing costs persist. It will mean trillions more spent simply servicing that debt. Now, what's more, we haven't yet hit the precipice of the fiscal cliff that CBO and other nonpartisan experts have been warning will result due to the aging population. And of course, that involves Social Security and Medicare. And the trustees of these two programs say the trust funds for both programs will be insolvent within the next 10 years. Moreover, CBO projects that spending for major health programs will skyrocket from 32% of federal revenue this day to 45% of revenue at mid-century. We can no longer afford to kick the can down the road. We must put an end to the governing crisis to crisis and get back to the fundamentals of government. And the fundamentals of government for Social Security and Medicare should cause us to look at the success that Reagan and then Democratic Speaker Tip O'Neill of the House of Representatives said we can't let Social Security go bankrupt. And they fixed it to this very day by tough decisions that we ought to be making today to fix it for the next 50 years like they did. And I'll bet maybe they, at that time, thought maybe they were only fixing it for 10 or 20 years. But that's from 1983 till now. Social Security's supposed to run out of reserves, by, I think, 2033. So what I'm saying is it means actually managing the government instead of doing it from crisis to crisis, and to do it by not chasing an elusive partisan ideal. That will require implementing honest budgets and appropriation practices that will enable us to begin to chip away at this daunting debt. According to the well-regarded Penn-Wharton budget model, the United States has about 20 years to take corrective action to avoid fiscal disaster. I almost hate to say 20 years, but Penn-Wharton is respected because that means that maybe we won't take the necessary action in the near term. And it's always easier to solve these problems yesterday than it is tomorrow. The longer we wait to take these actions, then obviously I'm saying the more painful those actions will be. In the Penn-Wharton estimation, if we put off corrective action until the fiscal crisis is at our doorstep, no amount of future tax hikes or spending cuts will enable us to avoid defaulting on our debt. When I just said, as I did, until a fiscal crisis is upon our doorstep, Iowans at my 99 county meetings that I hold every year would say that we're already at that point. And when you talk about maybe it can be done or not done, then you can imagine the cynical people of Iowa, just like the cynical people of the United States as a whole, are even going to lose less confidence in our government institutions. Now, we all know there's plenty of blame to go around for how we got into our current fiscal situation, but no amount of finger pointing, political or otherwise, will change where we find ourselves today. We must now make a choice. We can either continue down the path to fiscal ruin, or we can begin to rein in a bloated federal government in pursuit of a more prosperous tomorrow. Well, remember what I said about Ronald Reagan 59 years ago tomorrow. Also, in the words of Ronald Reagan, quote, "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny." Continuing to quote, we will preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness, end of quote. We see on television a lot of times people saying how god-awful this country is, and yet on that same television day, you can see 10,000 people crossing the border to come our country. For those people that live in America and have lived here all their life and find that America is not such a great place, they ought to wonder why people all over the world want to come to America. Or sometimes I tell people at citizenship ceremonies in the courthouses of Iowa, when I'm able to go there, I say to this group, many of them have come from autocracies to America, where they have less freedom than they have in America today. And I say to those people, I hope when you hear somebody that was born in America belly aching about how god-awful wrongs we have in this country, I hope you will remind them, as a person born in another country, how great this country is, because people that were born here lose sight of how great America is. So getting back to this fiscal issue I've been talking about, whether Ronald Reagan says it or I say it or each of my 99 colleagues say it, because I think to some extent we're all on the same page, maybe not how to solve the problem, but that there is a problem, then I say, like Reagan said, the choice is clear. It's time we do what our constituents sent us here to do, and that basically means to lead us out of this fiscal crisis. I yield the floor.